Okay. All right. Folks, we're live. So good afternoon, Tennessee Valley. This is the Valley Labor Report. We are coming to you in the middle of the week. My name is Jacob Morrison. It is Thursday, April the 1st, and we are broadcasting live online from my living room in beautiful downtown Huntsville, Alabama. Today, we are talking to international human rights attorney Thomas Becker. Longtime viewers will remember him from our Bolivia series. He's going to be talking to us about the hubbub surrounding the prosecution of coup officials by the Mas government. Thanks for tuning in. You all know where you can find us on social media. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/The Valley Labor Report. We're on Twitter at Labor Reporters. I'm on Twitter at JacobM_AL. David is on Twitter at Radical Unionist. That's spelled RADICL Unionist. He's not joining us today, but that's where you can find him. You can always go back and watch our past streams. So if you need to dip out sometime during the evening, no worries about that. You're still going to be able to find it. So you can also listen to us in podcast form on your listening platform of choice. And hey, make sure that you're subscribed to the channel and following us on all those social media places, because on Saturday, we're talking to another lawyer. I just realized that when I was writing up the intro for tonight, but we're talking to Brandon Magner. He's a labor lawyer, and we're going to be talking to him about what the Amazon union election would have looked like if the PRO Act had been law. After that, we're probably heading down to walk the line with striking coal miners in Alabama. So we may be sending you a dispatch from Brookwood on Saturday afternoon. And a little birdie told me that Lee Baines may be there on the line with his guitar as well. If you appreciate our work and want to help us stay on the air, then the best way to do that is to send a small amount of money our way. We've got hats and stickers on our website. You can find those at thevalleylaborreport.org. And if you just want to send us a couple dollars a month, then you can go to patreon.com/The Valley Labor Report. So Thomas Becker is an international human rights attorney. He successfully tried a former Bolivian president, the first time that was ever done on American soil. He's a graduate, and I believe he's a professor at Harvard Law School, but perhaps most impressively, he was a guest on our program back in November. So, Mr. Becker, thanks for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you. You're trying to get listeners. Why are you inviting all these lawyers on?
I know, right? Well, you know, sometimes y'all have interesting things to say. Sometimes.
Occasionally.
Yeah. And, I think that you have done a very good job in Bolivia, the work that you've done. You know, I'd really encourage folks to listen to our conversation back in November. But, so to get everyone caught up real quick, I think we're probably going to go deeper into the background later. But there was a coup in 2019 when Evo Morales was pushed out of power and Janine Áñez took over. If you don't believe it was a coup, you should really go back and watch our series on that. And get back with me. But the coup government presided over the bloodiest months in Bolivian history in the democratic age. Read outside of the dictatorships. Morales's Mas party, the movement towards socialism, won power again in the elections in 2020. The Mas is now headed by President Luis Arce, and they've recently begun prosecuting officials from the coup government, including former President Áñez. This has been decried by a vast majority of the kind of liberal international political establishment, from the Washington Post editorial board, Amnesty International, the Organization of American States, the European Union, the Bolivian Conference of Catholic Bishops, and even the United States Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, accusing the Mas of continuing a crisis of impunity, that judicial channels have become repressive instruments of the ruling party, and accusing the Mas of being anti-democratic. Becker, you fought against the coup government. You fought against the conservative government before the Mas party, and you fought against the Mas government while they were in power for legitimate human rights abuses that they did. So you're clearly, you're a straight shooter. If somebody commits human rights abuses, you're there and you're going to call a spade a spade. It doesn't matter if they call themselves a socialist or not. Is Moss overstepping here?
No. In short, no. The ex-government of Giannini Áñez carried out massive human rights violations. They carried out a coup. And just to give a little context, Bolivia has had, I believe, 196 coups or revolutions since the mid 1800s. It's had the most, or one of the top countries in the world, of coups. And so there's this horrible history of undemocratically removing people from power. So there needs to be accountability for this behavior. And so this government is holding accountable Áñez. I think there's a lot of criticisms on the ways in which it's going about, or the laws. I mean, there is, as you said, I'm happy to criticize all sides because I think it's my responsibility. A lot of the Bolivian laws are vague. They're using laws such as sedition and terrorism, which I think are very ambiguously worded and problematic laws. But those are the laws in the books, and they've been the laws in the books for decades. And they're utilizing the laws on the books to hold accountable people who really oversaw massacres, torture, arbitrary detentions. The list goes on and on. So, it's actually somewhat ironic to, claim what the current government is doing as political persecution when something like 1,500 people were detained during Áñez's government for, literally walking in the wrong neighborhood, being indigenous in a neighborhood of light-skinned rich people, writing articles criticizing the government, holding flyers that say, bullets for the poor, money for the rich. These are things that people were charged with sedition and terrorism for. That's political persecution.
Right. Yeah. Well, so, who specifically is being prosecuted, or I guess who are some of the biggest names?
Well, I mean, certainly Áñez, as the ex-president, she's, probably the highest level player. There's a few people two fled to the United States. Murillo, who was the interior minister, and Lopez, who was the defense minister, both allegedly are residing in Florida right now, which is always kind of has become a safe haven for a lot of despots that flee, particularly Latin American countries, but many countries after committing horrible abuses. And several military officials, I believe a couple high-level police officials. It's just beginning, because this is the complicated part, is there were so many human rights abuses that happened over this year. And so some of the people being arrested have been arrested under kind of the coup aspect. Some are being arrested under the massacres. And it is a bit messy right now. And I think a lot of those will be filtered into one. But it's, without boring you, without getting into all the legal stuff, there's different jurisdictions, there's different prosecutors in different regions. So there's all these different cases that have now finally begun to advance. I mean, during the government of Áñez, none of this stuff, the victims had no outlet for justice. Now they're kind of running forward and trying to get what they can. And I think they're throwing at the wall to see what sticks. But it's certainly like, it is an attempt to get justice for those who suffered immense violations over the last year and a half or so.
Can you talk about, I think this, it would be a good time to go over like what are the things that they did that they're being prosecuted for now. I said in the opening that the coup government presided over some of the bloodiest months in the democratic age in Bolivia. I mean, this is, it was like real bad stuff. Talk to us about some of the stuff that they're being prosecuted for.
Yeah, so I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. I should preface it with, again, so this is the first step. There was an arrest warrant, which is the first step. And so she's been arrested for her role in the coup. What's not clear yet is how many of the human rights violations will be then basically attached or part of this case, or if it's going to be a separate trial. So I'm speaking in vague terms because, again, there's different processes and it's not clear what exactly is going to fall under the umbrella right now. But I will give context of, what happened when Áñez took power. So, post-coup, her first week in power, her first days in power, she passed a decree 4078, which gave immunity to soldiers that carried out massacres. I think her third day in power, she carried out military operations in a town of Sacaba. A bunch of indigenous protesters came into town, protesting actually, they try to dismiss it and say, oh, these are all masistas, supporters of the Mas government. Many were not necessarily supporters of the Mas government. They were out protesting because there had been a huge increase of hate crimes, very targeted racialized crimes against indigenous people, particularly indigenous women. So there was this march for dignity. And the government, the military would not let them enter this large city of Cochabamba and opened fire on them, killing about 10, 11, injuring, I believe the official records are 122, but certainly more. I was there the day of the massacre, and I was with people in hiding who were injured, who were not reporting their injuries because they were scared they would be disappeared or that they would, register their name and come after them and their families. So the numbers are certainly higher. This is day 3. 4 days later, there was another massacre in Sancata, another, again, 10, 11 people killed, dozens injured. In both of these places, everybody killed or injured indigenous or a protester or a bystander. In terms of police forces or military forces killed or injured, there were 0. So these were very clear. I mean, I won't bore you with all the kind of the analysis we did, including like trajectory bullets and all this stuff. These were massacres, and again, she tried to give immunity to the soldiers that carried this out. This is her first week alone. And then it just, continued and continued. So they started arresting people for sedition. The minister of government said, we will hunt down members of the Mas party like the animals they are. And they started going after them, arresting them one after another. The minister of communications said, we have a list of journalists that are seditious. And they will be held accountable. And the way they did that is they went after them. They shut down stations that were critical of the Áñez government. They arrested certain journalists for sedition. They arrested even, I think I mentioned this on the last time we spoke. There was an article written by this student, a grad student, who published it on a website. And the domain owner of the website was charged with sedition and maybe terrorism as well for just owning the domain of this that published this article. They really went after people who spoke out against the government really hard. There were several that were attacked. So they went after, to summarize, they went after political opponents, critics, journalists, human rights defenders, and really indigenous people. I mean, Áñez, just to give a little context, before she came in power, nobody really knew who she was. The only thing people knew about her is that she was this woman who had tweeted, indigenous rituals are satanic. Right when she took power, she carried this Bible that was, quite literally the size of her torso, and said that, that Pachamama will not return, the indigenous goddess will not return to the palace, that the god is returned to the palace or something like that. So, this very right-wing, very, very conservative Christian with really problematic views towards indigenous people.
So, I prefaced this part of the conversation with all of the denunciations by the by a lot of the international order. What do they want the Mas government to do? I mean, they literally, the coup government, I mean, they did a coup, so there's one thing, right? But they massacred people. They murdered innocent people that were protesting, exercising their right to freedom of speech, and they murdered people. And they did political persecution. Like you said, I don't think you said that the last time that you were on. Maybe I'd have to go back and check. But going after somebody for owning a domain to which an article was posted, I mean, that's like, what is Arce supposed to do now? What are they saying that he needs to do?
So there's a mixture of voices. I think really when this first happened, Áñez had said, I'm being politically persecuted. And it was really seen as kind of almost, fringish. People were like, come on, after this whole year, I don't know if you're going to play that card. But right. Then you have Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS, who's been a really problematic player over the last, a very politicized player, gone really hard after Bolivia, gone hard after other human rights folks, and really, got up really involved in this fraud mess. And I think he's just doubling down, and he came out and condemned it. And then you have the US government backing it. And then you do have, organizations like Human Rights Watch who also condemned it. And honestly, from a lawyer's perspective, I think it was really premature so initially all the outrage was based on 4 leaked pages of an arrest warrant. So initially when that came out, the press was reaching out to me as well. And I didn't make a statement because there are 4 leaked pages. 1, you have to verify they're real. 2, 4 of many pages. And these, by the way, these 4 leaked pages, allegedly, I mean, they were allegedly leaked by someone who was pro Anya's to tip her off so that she could, escape from the country. So, there's a lot of supporting documentation, not just 4 pages. So to prematurely make statements condemning this, it's pretty questionable from a lawyer's perspective. It's why I didn't make statements initially too, because if it was just those 4 pages, then that's one thing. If there's 300 supporting pages of all the abuses, boy, there's a lot, to show crimes. And again, we still don't know if the human rights abuses are being absorbed into this or a part of this coup case, or if it's going to be a separate trial. So, I think one of the criticisms, and I agree with it, and I mentioned this already, is that Bolivia has very ambiguous laws on terrorism and sedition that I think have historically been used to go after political opponents. Now, is that innate to this government? No, it's been the ones on the books for a long time. And Congress, I think, personally should write new laws. But utilizing the laws that are available to you to hold accountable people who carried out abuses, we can have an intellectual discussion about, oh, these are too vague and we should change the law to this. That's fine, we can have that. But that does not mean that this is political persecution. It means this government's using what's available to them. And so I think it's really been derailed. The conversation it's been a distraction, about, folks have suffered so much over the last year, and it's removed the conversation of all the victims to now Anya's is the victim, and it's really problematic. It's really problematic.
So is the criticism then, is it even about do these people not deserve to be punished? Is it actually just about the laws that are being used?
Well, so the human rights perspective, Human Rights Watch, for instance, I think it's technicalities. It's like, these are not the right laws. They should utilize these other laws. And my opinion is some of the other laws would probably be more effective. But I also think, let's just put it this way. Even if the sedition law is too vague, I can't think of a more clear case of sedition than overthrowing a democratically elected government, coming into power, and then using that power. Even if she was really an interim president, her only mandate was to call elections. Instead, she started just blasting through privatization policies, blasting through these anti-indigenous things, and killing people. So, in fairness, whatever it says on the books, that's pretty black and white sedition. But I do think that some of the other laws, crimes against humanity, extrajudicial killings, again, I'm not going to bore you with all the lawyer stuff. I think there are more, I think there are different avenues that might make more sense than the sedition laws or the terrorism laws. So that's a very I feel like kind of splitting hairs within the human rights conversation. Then you have the United States government, who was not only silent during the massacres last year and silent during just widespread political persecution, but actually propped up this government, supported this government. So, I think the U.S. approach is different. It's not about the technicality of the laws. It's just a really politicized perspective, and it's both sides. It's Democrats and Republicans. This is
now Tommy, Biden is president now. I mean, everything's better, I thought, is what was supposed to happen.
Yeah, I did read that on Facebook, but
I thought he was great. I thought this was Uncle Joe, and he was gonna treat everybody good, and there were no problems. That's what I'd been led to believe.
Yeah, well, Uncle Joe's certainly surrounded with himself by some folks that I think have pretty problematic past. Certainly, I recognize. So the Trump administration was just horrific on this stuff. There was hope that the Biden administration would be better, but part of this is, some of the folks that have been advising Biden are people, and I think I mentioned this on the show before. Mark Fierstein, he's part of CLS Strategies. He's been an advisor to Biden. He was part of the Obama government, and he was hired by the Anya's government to spread fake news. CLS Strategies was the first organization punished, U.S. organization punished by Facebook for putting up, fake news. They were spreading all this fake news and hashtags like it's not a coup, and there's fraud. This is my rough translation, hashtag translation. But when you have people that are hired by Áñez advising the Biden administration, it shouldn't be a surprise that their response is less than even-handed.
Yeah. Well, I think that how ought this affect the way that folks view people like Biden, outlets like the Washington Post, the European Union, the Organization for American States, because, like I said, I know people that they read the Washington Post and they're like, this is good, fact-based liberal journalism, never mind the fact that it's owned by Jeff Bezos, but, they read the condemnation in the paper and they say, wow, these socialists in Bolivia, they must be bad. And that opinion, that reading of it is certainly would be bolstered by, the consensus position of the international order. Like how ought this color the way that we view these institutions?
Well, so as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, like when this first happened, even folks that were kind of, I would say, coup supporters, I don't know if they necessarily thought this was political persecution, because Áñez, it's pretty black and white, some of her behavior. But then when you have these institutions saying, no, she's the victim, it really legitimizes what she said, and it's just snowballed. So you have, when you have the State Department saying it, then you do have, other allies in Latin America or in Europe saying, oh, what is going on with this government? And the really sad part is, there's been a lot of signals of this government to reach across the aisle. In Lucho, Luis Arce is his name, but he goes by Lucho. In his acceptance speech, he said, this is a time for reconciliation. We are a divided Bolivia. He recognized, we may not even agree with how the other side approach things, but we need to come together or Bolivia is going to crumble. And so you've seen all these steps towards that. And then, so this is not a radical government. Frankly, if you look at the discourse of Evo Morales versus Lucho, it's quite different. Or Chavez, or, Castro in Cuba. Like, he's a very soft-spoken, not a confrontational person, and the kind of person that's really looked to normalize relations with the United States. And it's a real unfortunate thing that, the U.S. has responded like this. I know the foreign relations minister is a human rights lawyer. I worked with him for years in a trial in Bolivia against generals and ministers who carried out the massacres. As you mentioned, I have worked on this case against the ex-president of Bolivia for years in the US, but I also worked on an accompanying trial in Bolivia. And he was the lead lawyer on this. This is a person who's dedicated his life to human rights, to working with marginalized communities. He's of the people. He's an Aymara, from a very humble background. He's, in short, he's a really good guy. He's not a confrontational guy. And this government, again, I have my criticisms of certain things they've done, but they've really showed a lot of effort to kind of build relations with the United States, build relations with the other side. And then you have these blanket statements of, this is political persecution. This woman carried out massacres and illegally came to power, but it doesn't matter. She's the victim, not these indigenous people who were gunned down. And it's really going to it's backing Bolivia into a corner where, in the end, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think they're going to isolate Bolivia so much that they do have to, I don't think they're going to become extremists, but I think that it just pushes them to a situation where they will have to kind of isolate themselves more.
Right. Well, speaking of like what the things that Áñez and her government were doing during the coup, what was the posture of these institutions during the coup government? Because, like I said before we went live, like I don't recall seeing the pearl clutching Washington Post editorial board opinion piece about the coup government. Maybe there was one, it was in power for a year, and I don't read the Washington Post every day, but like where were all these institutions? What were they saying during the coup?
Well, so I will say that Human Rights Watch, when the coup happened, Jose Miguel Vivanco, who's the head of the Americas division, the one who's been outspoken about what's going on now, he did call it a coup. It's actually quite surprising. He said it was a coup and really has never said it again since. So I don't know what's changed. Human Rights Watch did put out a report on political persecution during Áñez. And so I think a lot of his discourse around this about political persecution is kind of couched in what they've already focused on in Bolivia. But yeah, no, I mean, the US government was supportive of Áñez. Trump wrote tweets congratulating her for, bringing democracy back to Bolivia, ironically.
Right.
And, and the Washington Post had mixed, on the one hand, they did do a report on whether there was fraud and found that there was not fraud, these allegations of fraud. They did do I think a actually pretty good article in March 2020 on a lot of the abuses, but then they've kind of gone back and forth. And a lot of these major papers go back and forth. And I think they, try to claim this is balance, but it's like, opinions are one thing. News is news and opinions are another thing. And a lot of this stuff is just based on kind of partisan, opinions, I'm a human right. I have my own personal opinions, but I'm a human rights lawyer. So like when I say there's a massacre, it's not like I say, I think that there was a massacre. We spent 8 months documenting this stuff, interviewing hundreds of people, including police and military and members of the government and all the victims and witnesses, and analyzing bullet trajectories and all this stuff. Like scientifically and academically and clinically, these were massacres. So these are not opinions, or the law that she passed giving immunity to soldiers who killed people. That's objectively illegal. You know what I mean? This is not like, I think it's bad. And I think a lot of the stuff is just turned into opinion pieces because, folks lobby the right people, and the Bolivian, sorry, just to give a little context, the Bolivian right has been very, the ex-president that I sued, his lawyer was Obama's White House counsel. One of his lawyers, another one of his lawyers is Alan Dershowitz, who has represented Clinton and Trump. The list goes on. There's other people in the Bush administration, and they've been very strategic about having friends on both sides of the aisle. So you have kind of the ruling class. That's kind of always been the voice, I think, filtering the information to folks in the US in these positions of power. And so I think they just missed the mark over and over, unfortunately. And it's poor and indigenous people that suffer.
Right. Yeah, it seems to me that that's kind of the difference between like your work and maybe some of these condemnations that have come out about the prosecutions, because your work, even when you were fighting the Mas government, you were fighting it on behalf of like working people. It was there was a pipeline or a road or something that was being built through an indigenous community, and there were protests, and the Mas government had people like there were people shot at or something. Isn't that right? Yeah, and so you like you challenged the Mas government on that, but that was not on behalf of like right-wing oligarchs or coup mongers and something. And like look, they deserve due process and things like that just as much as anybody, but like that's what they're getting right now, right? Like there would be no other, in Blinken's tweet, there was something about there needs to be an independent inquiry and a trial and due process. And it's like, how else do you have due process without a trial and without, arresting them?
Well, I mean, the irony of particularly the U.S. State Department statement, one, I think they made it a day or two after prosecutors said that they have proof that they are going to probably bring charges for sedition against those who stormed the Capitol in the U.S., which is bad, but drastically less than overthrowing a government, like installing a totally new government. And two, this is based on an arrest warrant. The bar in the United States is so shockingly low, and this is a criticism I have. I think that the bars are too low for arrest warrants. I think I have problems with, I'm somewhat of an abolitionist in general. So I can speak like abstractly or theoretically where I don't like some of these things, but I don't see where the United States has any space to make these criticisms where, some cop just feels like that guy's a person of color. I can go break into his house. That's enough to, get her, or I can just send this to a judge without anything and you get an arrest warrant. This woman really carried out some pretty egregious things. The other, I would say there's 3 people that are really in charge of the most egregious pieces of like the massacres. 2 of them have fled to the US. So there are reasons. It's not like they were like, oh, we just want to like throw her behind bars. To give a little more context, the trial that I said I worked on with the Minister of Foreign Relations, I believe that there were 19 people charged, 19 ministers and then the ex-president. 17 of them fled Bolivia and have never come back. Only 2 ministers of all of them were held accountable, because there is this culture of fleeing the country. And right. For instance, they live in the United States now. The U.S. isn't going to extradite them. They sought the extradition of the ex-president that I've sued here. So it's not like, it's really unfortunate to not talk about the context of the reality in Bolivia, that people carry out abuses and then flee to the United States or Colombia or Peru or Spain and get away with this stuff. And so this woman oversaw some really egregious things and was arrested. Again, I actually agree, somewhat with Human Rights Watch. I think that the terrorism charges are very vague. I think the language should be narrowed down. Same with sedition. But I also do think that sedition, overthrowing a government sounds pretty seditious to me.
Right. Are there any, okay, here's a question. Are there any coup government officials that, like, so you're saying that there are a lot of this, you're saying a lot of the criticism is kind of on technicalities, right? That these rules should maybe be changed, but fundamentally, it seems to you that, maybe there should be a different law other than sedition. But like Janine Áñez did sedition, and she deserves to be, her victims deserve justice. Are there any people that are being prosecuted by the Mas government that ought not be? Technicality or no? Is there any place where the Mas government is overstepping their bounds, and like this is a person who is kind of incidental and not really and like they need to like be like let free or like or something like that?
No, I know what you're saying. I don't know. I haven't seen any, but I'm open to the fact that there could be folks that have gotten rounded up. I mean, when I say rounded up, it really isn't, there isn't this like list of like, again, there was like 1,500 people arrested in a year under Áñez.
Right.
Dozens and dozens and dozens of officials with the Mas that were just arrested for being with the Mas. Many went into hiding, you know what I mean? Actually, hundreds of officials, that were under, I forget the exact number, that were under investigation or charged, and dozens that had to flee the country. I mean, it's just like, it's a shockingly, if we are concerned with what's happening to Áñez, if you're concerned about that and not concerned about what happened the last year, you're politicizing the situation.
Yeah.
That being said, I do, it's possible. The Mas may take advantage of this. There may be folks that shouldn't be charged. I haven't seen that yet. For what I've seen has been primarily high-level generals, leaders of paramilitary groups, and Áñez. And really, these are the folks that carried out this really horrific behavior.
Right.
Really, I think the government's, if you were to hear the voices of the victims, they want to see a lot more people being held accountable, because it's not just, these couple folks. It's like the military massacred people. Right. And the military is now pointing the finger at Áñez and saying, well, she gave us the green light to do it. And she's pointing the fingers back at, this is what happens. And what happens is so much dust gets thrown up into the air, then people don't know what the truth is. And then the victims never get justice. I believe it's a political tactic that's being utilized by the right to just make it, I mean, it's been successful. You see, like we're talking about, the US government's approach to this is really like, whether technicalities or not, some horrific things happen, and that's not even part of the conversation. He has become the victim after victimizing hundreds, if not thousands of people.
Yeah. And the context of the American criticism of Bolivia is really silly, especially here in Alabama, where our legislature is looking to pass a quote anti-riot law. That's what it's being billed as, but what it would actually do is give cops vast discretion, which everyone knows, like, that's not going to be abused. And if there is a situation where like cops feel like it could devolve into a riot and they tell you to leave and you don't, you can be arrested and hold on bail. And if you're arrested under this law, you're held in bail, like without bail, like you can't bail yourself out for a minimum of 24 hours. Originally, it was going to be 48 hours. Now it's only 24, but still, like 24 hours is somebody's going to lose their job because of this without any damage or harm being done to anybody. If the police sick their dog on somebody and a medic comes to from the protesters and a medic comes to give first aid to this person, they can be arrested as a rioter and charged and put
which happened in Bolivia. A person that was a nurse that was allegedly a nurse that was helping people.
Wow.
Went to jail for, I think was charged with terrorism too. I mean, This is the irony of these like allegations of political persecution. Sorry, under Áñez.
Yeah.
You know.
Right. Under Áñez. Good. I knew what you meant, but it's good that you clarified that. So, I think that mostly answers my question. And so, you said like, it seems to you that this is kind of a political ploy to get us talking about contexts and technicalities and laws and whose fault is it and whose fault isn't. And we're not actually talking about the victims of the coup. And so let's round it out by like, going over one more time, like what was the actual toll on the Bolivian people of the coup government?
Actually, can I hit rewind? Because I did just think of something that I think is worth mentioning in terms of, I think the government casting too not wide of a net. But again, I think it's just been, it's really at the end of the day, I think leftist governments have to dot their I's and cross their T's. They're held to a different standard than right-wing governments or governments ruled by people that are light-skinned like me in countries where people generally don't look like me. And the government proposed an amnesty law for those arrested during Áñez. Like I said, there were, I think the most recent calculation was something like 1,500 political prisoners. And so they're giving freedom to them. There's criticism that this allows a lot of people to get out that committed human rights violations. And I actually agree. I think that some of the people, some like pro-Mas protesters burnt homes or destroyed business, like looted and did. Some people that carried out crimes will get away with that. Now, this is the really, but there's never discussion on nuance. Right. You have 1,500 people rotting away in jails who've been in jails for like a year, quite literally. You know what I mean?
Right.
In jails where the pandemic is out of control. With really horrific conditions. So you have to balance, like, how do you deal with unfairly people that have been arbitrarily detained with those who actually committed crimes and justice for the victims of those abuses? And so that was criticized as well, I think, by Human Rights Watch, for instance. But it's this radically false equivalence of like giving immunity to soldiers who gunned down people, which is unquestionably illegal, versus finding amnesty to help many, many victimized victims who are in jail. These are just, the intentionality is really different. Again, I think like my criticism is, I think if you do these kinds of amnesty laws, you have to be very specific so that the right people get out and the wrong people, there is accountability for people that do this stuff. And I think, this I think is less of a, we're trying to, let our friends out or we're trying to persecute people. I think it's more of a, hey, we're a country struggling in this crisis and trying to address all these things and recover after a year of just horrific abuses. And you have a country who doesn't have the strength of judicial institutions or, you know what I mean? Like and legislation, doing a not the best job is very different than going out there and trying to persecute people or allow people to, get away with abuses. And I think it's just been mischaracterized. But I did want to highlight, so that would be one of my critiques. I don't think this amnesty law, I think an amnesty law makes sense under very strict conditions, but so there are errors that this government is making
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, I wouldn't even say apples and oranges. It's not even the same universe as what took place the previous year.
Well, and, you know, speaking of nuance, it might be worth even considering, like, okay, you know, they've been in prison for a year. Like, are there even any offenses for which you would be in jail for longer than a year? You know, I don't know, if somebody burned down a house, I guess probably, but you know, that takes, you know, it seemed to me that even more would fall under that category. You know, people who were unduly, like unfairly put in prison, and then people who were put in prison like for cause, but that, you know, have time served, so to speak.
Totally. The problem is that this government, they're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't. They're in a no-win situation, and there's a very smart right with very strong lobby in the United States that knows how to capitalize on any single mistake or misstep or, you know, lesser of two evils situations. They're going to jump on it. And so, and again, I'm not saying like I'm not pro Moss. I'm not pro any. I mean, I'm not really the like anarchist tendencies in me. You know, I don't know if I'm into any government, but you know, this is not. I'm like a get out of jail card for them. But I think they're being held to a standard that has not been applied to people on the other side. It's being unfairly, you know, applied to them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think. I mean, I don't see how people could disagree with that. I you know, like I said, I've just been like gobsmacked at the you know, polite society, international order reaction to the prosecution of these people who carried out really, really horrible crimes. And I'm just sitting here wondering, like, where were y'all? Where were they a year ago when people were being like murdered in the street? You know, it's.
You know what though? I think the elephant in the room, or maybe it's, you know, maybe it is obvious, since at least to folks that know Bolivia, you know, Áñez is a very light-skinned. She's a blonde woman who doesn't have this. You know, I think that, you know, as I mentioned, like a lot of coups, we think of coups as like the mustachioed Banana Republic military guy driving in a tank. She doesn't look like that. She looks like you and me more than she looks like the majority of Bolivians. You know, and I think, you know, people won't say it, but there's a lot of racism still. And when indigenous people get killed or thrown in jail, a lot of these institutions don't seem to care quite as much as when someone who looks like them does get thrown in jail. And I think she's an articulate, educated woman, light-skinned, and I think she's been able, she looks like the victim. Even if you see the photos of her, she's wearing, when she was arrested, she's wearing like a sweatshirt with like a kitten on it. And it's like, they've really marketed that like on social media to be like, oh, poor victim, look at, she's got her kitty sweatshirt. But at the same time, you see an indigenous person bleeding who's just been beaten. And the language around that is, well, this savage narco-terrorist, you know, is trying to kill people or blow up the city, and they deserve what's happening to them. So, you know, racism is really fueling a lot of this, and US-based racism.
Yeah, well, and the racism, and how do you, and what, and I mean, how do you feel about the capitalism as a, you know, Bolivia has, I believe it's the world's largest lithium mines. And, you know, in Biden's, you know, like, look, Biden's infrastructure plan, it looks great, but there's a whole lot of electric cars in that infrastructure plan, you know? And like you said, Áñez embarked while she was interim president with nothing more than a mandate to, if such a mandate even existed, the biggest her mandate was to hold elections again. While she was interim president, she embarked on a vast privatization scheme that never would have passed a vote of the people in Bolivia. And you know, how do you feel about that as an explanation as well? You know, I mean, Biden.
So I think folks on the left in the U.S. sometimes try to simplify it like natural, you know, resources in another country, U.S. imperialism, we want their resources. And I think that's a piece of the puzzle, the equation. But there's many factors. I think a lot of it's just discourse. Like Evo Morales was very outspoken. His discourse was very anti-capitalist. At the end of the day, he actually was pretty capitalist. The economy is capitalist. He did a lot of extractivism. He didn't sell it to the US for less than market value like Goni, the previous president, the guy that I have been suing all these years. sold it to Enron and other companies for below market value because, didn't have that level of like, we're hooking you up. And so I think there was some resentment from that, but a lot of it's discourse and just this weird, Cold War politics that still exist. And they don't like some guy saying, the imperialist United States. And so the idea of having, at least in discourse, a socialist country in their backyard, they don't like that. And Áñez was certainly a free market friend, more so than Lucho, who still has a capitalist economy, but it's a lot more controlled. And a lot of the resources, I think, are diverted more back to programs for working people and healthcare and education. But yeah, certainly capitalism is part of this. And really, they just don't like people that don't play well with us. You know what I mean? There's this very colonialist, they want to be the puppet masters in many ways. And I think there's resentment when you have people saying, no, screw you. Like you can't just come down and take our resources, or we'll govern our government how we want to, or we want to hold accountable people that killed a bunch of folks, or that overthrew a democratically elected government. That sort of U.S. interventionism, selective U.S. interventionism, they push back on that. And I think the U.S. doesn't like it. So I think that's a big piece of what's really fueling with why the U.S. is just really taking the wrong approach on this.
Yeah, you mentioned that that Evo was, like he was he was a socialist, but his economy was not like there were very capitalistic elements. And if you want maybe some more on that, our interview with Angus McNally from back in November was really interesting about the way that labor and social movements played into Bolivian politics from 2005 to 2019, and we talked about the nationalization schemes of the mines and stuff, and how if you actually look at it, it wasn't quite nationalization.
Yeah, it's like 50.1% or something. So it took a higher percentage, and U.S. corporations don't like that, but it's not a state-controlled company.
Right. Which I thought was strange as somebody who perceived Evo as, a very, very socialist guy. But, I mean, like a lot of the other pink tide governments in Central and South America, it was very much more kind of real social democratic politics with socialist rhetoric, as opposed to, socialist rhetoric matched with fully socialist policies. It looks like Norway
or Sweden more than it does, Cuba at the end of the day. And
even less like Norway, because 50% of the wealth in Norway is owned by the public. It's like publicly owned. They have a national wealth fund or something, and their oil is completely state owned. Their resources are completely, it's like Nor Oil or something, I can't recall what it is, but it's like that's real nationalization in Europe. But, I don't know, maybe it's because what you were saying earlier, it was white folks doing it, so it's not as big a deal. And we're folks that America does not perceive as kind of our backyard, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're right, because really, it's not it's the funny thing is that all the rhetoric around this Castro Chavista communist state and all this stuff, it's really Scandinavian light with a little more fiery rhetoric. And I would say that Lucho, the current president, his rhetoric is not any more radical than anyone in Norway or Sweden or Denmark. But then they've just kind of been pigeonholed as this kind of like rogue leftist socialist state and an enemy basically to American values.
Right. I know that this isn't your wheelhouse, but I just thought about it. I'm a union guy, so I'm interested in how integrated is the labor movement currently into this is way off of the human rights subject, and if you don't know, that's fine. But how are they reacting even to these concerns about silly concerns about human rights violations, but the trajectory of the Arce government maybe more broadly.
So I'll just rewind a little just to give some context. So I think, the labor, we talked about this last time, but I've never seen anything like labor in Bolivia. I mean, if something is, in Sucre, if the domestic workers union says one of our workers was killed on the job, you'll have the entire city of La Paz shut down because the miners will come into town, the cocaleros, the campesinos. I mean, they mobilize. It's amazing. There's a lot of power by the unions. Particularly the beginning of the Morales government, it started to fade because it was somewhat co-opted by the government. When Áñez came to power, there was no real dialogue between the unions and the government really treated them like they were, animals or Castro Chavistas or narco terrorists. And so they had no role. In this new government, I think there's more optimism. That being said, Lucho was very much, he was the economy minister under Evo. And he is the one who really had this kind of mixed socialist, communist, or socialist and capitalist economy. And so he's more, I would say he's more conservative economically, and not conservative like by US standards by any level. So it's not clear what role the unions will play. I mean, certainly the unions supported him and voted for him. He won with 50+%, just completely knocked it out of the park in terms of, beat the second place candidate, doubled what the second place candidate had. So it was a very big win. When he gave his acceptance speeches, one of the major union leaders, who unfortunately was killed only a few days later, allegedly by parastate groups, but there's, the information, specifics have not come out yet. They were part of that. They've been part of these meetings. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I think I'm speculating. I think certainly more so, way more so than under the Áñez government, the unions will play a big role. I think Lucho is a very safe president in terms of, not a big risk taker. I don't think he's going to nationalize half the country. And he was actually really successful. I should just mention that Bolivia had the fastest, and may still, I don't know about this year after the coup and the pandemic, but had the fastest growing economy in South America for several years under Evo's government, with Lucho as the head of the Minister of the Economy. So I think he's going to continue the path he had, which was somewhat capitalist, somewhat socialist, extractivist, pretty good with labor. I wish better with labor. Again, my critiques come from the left, so I do have my criticisms of the government, but I don't know yet. They're really, basically he inherited a mess. He inherited a country where 30% of the people want to overthrow him, where, or maybe even more, where at least 25% are saying racist things every single day and are beating up indigenous people and doing horrific things, where you have a pandemic, where you have a struggling economy because Áñez mismanaged virtually everything when she was in power. So a lot of his policies, it's just getting to the point where he's starting to implement policies, and we're seeing, okay, what kind of president is Lucho going to be in terms of his relation to social movements and the labor movement?
Right. So, I think that's a good place to round it out. And we can wrap it up by, reminding folks like you talked about, wanting to kind of center the victims of the coup government and being kind of dissatisfied at the fact that the conversation is around, like, is what Moss doing right, rather than what did the victims have to suffer. So let's, remind us of what the folks did that are being prosecuted by the Moss government.
I mean, it starts with removing a democratically elected president and his vice president and president of Congress and president of Senate and dozens of other officials who resigned under duress, and then putting in power an unelected president, having the church and the Brazilian ambassador from a very right-wing government being part of this conversation. A bunch of unelected officials chose this woman. She came to power, and then rather than calling for elections, which has happened years ago in Bolivia, a similar situation happened and the person called elections immediately. She didn't call elections. Instead, she just started forcing through this right-wing mandate and jailing opponents, shutting down critical stations, overseeing massacres, torturing, allowing torture to take place in jails and other places, empowering paramilitary groups who carry out murders and tortures and other crimes. And there needs to be accountability. If not, again, Bolivia's suffered from more coups and revolutions than virtually any country on this planet. And there needs to be an end to this sort of behavior, and there needs to be accountability. If there's not accountability, it's going to happen again and again and again. And it can happen on the left and right. And that's why this is, like, certainly my politics are left. I don't pretend that they're not. But no left-wing government should do it, nor right-wing government. And all this is doing is sending the message, it's okay. You can overthrow a government, and then you can kill people who speak out against you. And if they don't hold her accountable, it's going to continue.
Right. Thomas, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I know that you're really busy. You're doing real people things, and I appreciate you taking the time. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about this. I think you're doing really good work, and so I appreciate you sharing with us.
Thanks. Always happy to. Really enjoy it.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, folks, that was Thomas Becker, international human rights attorney. And make sure that you're following us everywhere. We're going to be talking to Brandon Magner. He's a labor lawyer on Saturday about what the Amazon union election would have looked like if the PRO Act had been law. Then we're going to go down to Brookwood to walk the picket line with some striking mine workers. So make sure that you're following us so that you get all of